World War One is the last section of kind of this overall kind of Gilded Age, this period of progress, growth, new ways of doing business, new ways, new innovations in the way we live, new expansions. You also have new ways of envisioning the role of government. So one of the things that you hopefully have kind of extracted from talking about the reform and the progressive era is that in response to kind of what is seen as the abuses of capitalism, what you fundamentally have is the idea of, changing the way government functions. And Woodrow Wilson, as I mentioned kind of in the progressive PowerPoint, he is one of these progressive presidents. So he definitely embraces a new view about how the United States should interact with the world. Now, there's some problems, there's some gaps there in the sense that he very clearly sees himself as kind of a moral leader, even though his actions don't always kind of play out that way. And he definitely, his concern is more about creating an economically fair playing field and then the government taking his hands off. So the government kind of writes the scales and then they let people just kind of figure things out. So this is why so many of his progressive reforms revolve around domestic policies, revolve around economics, revolve around tariff reform, revolve around creating stability in the banking system. And so he definitely kind of addresses that aspect of things as opposed to kind of social progressivism where we're going to create equality between people or, trying to balance out trying to side a little bit more with the big businesses that you kind of saw Taft do. So he's got kind of a unique perspective. So I don't want to rehash the progressive period, but you definitely need to go into World War One, understanding that Woodrow Wilson is a unique guy. Very full of himself, very convinced of his rightness, very convinced that he's God ordained, that he's got all the answers, very, very full of himself. Now, the world going into 1914 is a world defined by European colonialism. And obviously, having looked at imperialism, we know the United States has, to a certain extent, joined Europe in this kind of colonial expansion. Not quite to the same level, and you can see here how much territory Britain owned, how much territory France owned, the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these places are known for violence, concentration camps, exploitation, just terrible treatment. So when Rudyard Kipling said, take up the white man's burden, he's calling on the United States to follow Britain's model. The U.S. rejects that. Ultimately, the U.S., will turn away from that, whether that's just because of fatigue with trying to take care of the Western Hemisphere, whether that's because of the Philippines. Just the whole idea of having to rely on a big military is an issue. So you have the U.S. having gained these territories. We've built up a Navy. We've bought into Mahan's naval theory. But as we're going from, say, 1907, 1910, into like 1914, the U.S. is really starting to kind of turn away from military engagement. Or let me rephrase that. We want to turn away from military engagement. Actually doing it is much harder than saying it. And so, we have this Navy, we have this military power. The Roosevelt corollary has kind of beefed up the Monroe Doctrine. The dollar diplomacy has gotten the United States engaged in the Western Hemisphere economically. And so this is kind of the situation we're left with when Woodrow Wilson becomes the president. Woodrow Wilson, as the president, of course, is going to be the one who kind of takes us kind of full on into global engagement. And we'll be looking at and kind of discussing some of his speeches in class, some of the contrasts of Woodrow Wilson. I think we'll probably do that after the first class, where we'll focus kind of on the home front and how the home front was and kind of examine that. So Wilson's foreign policy, while he tries to strike that new note, he ends up acting a whole lot like Roosevelt. And you can see the degree to which he sends troops all over the place to promote stability, to kind of influence the economic circumstances of some of these countries that, where you had American businesses that were entangled there. The big one, of course, is going to be Mexico. And for our purposes of World War I, not understanding the Mexican Revolution, but understanding that we had been involved in Mexico helps make some of the details going into World War I make a little more sense. So without diving off too much into what that looked like, just know that Mexico had had a lot of American investment. That investment had ultimately led to a concern about the politics of Mexico. You had kind of an uprising. You had some of these guys who were trying to become the president of Mexico, who were taking advantage, if you will, of kind of the relationship with America, seeking American approval. And then you also had people who were using these bosses, these jefes, to kind of take the lead and kind of act as de facto gangs. So a lot of times I'll compare kind of Mexico at this period of, 1912, 1913. It looks a whole lot like kind of Mexico being controlled by drug gangs, with a political environment that's trying to play nice with the United States, but really a kind of these roving gangs that control areas of territory that don't always follow what the politicians in Mexico say. So you have, particularly with Pancho Villa, incursions into the United States, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona, and he kills a few people. This has a lot to do with, concern about weapons deals and buying guns from the United States. And so this will cause Woodrow Wilson to send American troops into Mexico, and ultimately will occupy Veracruz, will, go all the way into Mexico City. And really it's about kind of promoting stability and trying to force these other countries in the Western Hemisphere, Central America, South America, Mexico, into being, favorable to American businesses and not having political instability, which of course was the whole point of the Roosevelt Corollary. Europe before 1914, just a couple of basic concepts. Huge population, middle and working class increase, just like in the United States. You'd had a lot of peace, but part of the reason why you'd had decades of peace in Europe is because they had been otherwise engaged in colonialism, right? So Britain wasn't having to fight with France or with Germany. They were going over to Africa and fighting Zulus. So this kind of allowed them to not be at odds with each other. Another kind of factor to this too is Queen Victoria. A lot of these royal families are connected to the British royal family. So initially in the 1800s, they are less inclined to fight with each other because of all this kind of interrelationship. Regardless of that, you have them kind of coming through the late 1800s. You have the development of an alliance system. Germany had become a unified country. You have a series of alliances, and you don't have to know the specific alliances. Just know that you had kind of some changing alliances, France and Austria-Hungary, or Germany and Austria-Hungary, Russia and France. Italy sometimes was involved with that. You had a Franco-Prussian War where France and the German states kind of fought with each other, and this kind of allowed for Germany to take Alsace and Lorraine as some territory. So you've got some squabbling, but no significant wars or battles, largely because you've got the system of alliances where, hey, don't pick on my friends over here or else you're going to pick on me. So that's a big part of it. Another part of it is militarism, the buildup of military weapons, Mahan's naval theory. It's not just popular in the United States. The Kaiser Wilhelm is a huge advocate of it. Britain is a huge advocate of it. So this idea that strong nations need strong navies, which need strong trade, which need strong bases, is kind of an idea that captures kind of the global leaders and captures their imagination. So lots of alliances where don't pick on my friends or I'm going to fight with you. Lots of militarism, big military. Nationalism. So one of the trends that we see happening in this kind of modern period of the 20th century is an awareness of national identity. I'm American, I'm British, I'm Serbian, I'm Croatian. What does that mean? What language, what culture, what customs? Some of this has to do because you've got the migration of people all over the globe. Some of it has to do with kind of strengthening democratic systems, the fact that, in England and Germany and France, you'd had ordinary voters, expanded suffrage, that kind of thing happening. And so as people begin to have more of a say in their government, they feel more of a national identity. And countries that were not allowed to determine their government, right? Countries that were part of, say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, were starting to have some resentment that they weren't being allowed to control things themselves. They're looking at these other countries, they're looking at other voters. Well, they can have a say in their government, and they have a government that looks like them, so that's what we want. So lots of desire for self-determination, most particularly in what is called the Balkans region, which is that area kind of around Greece, right? And I'll have to, let me pull up a map here. Let's see, Europe in 1914. Pull up an image, see if this one will work. Come here. All right, so the Balkans region is going to be this area right here. So you have, of course, here's the United Kingdom, here's France. Alsace and Lorraine is this kind of area right here. For generations, it had gone back and forth between France and Germany. So the Franco-Prussian War gives it back to Germany. Austria-Hungary is right here. It's a massive place, but they essentially had control over places like Serbia, Montenegro. So they kind of had them as kind of like little brothers, or like their freshman, little sister, little brother kind of thing. And so you kind of have them acting, wanting to be independent, not appreciating the role of Austria-Hungary and kind of holding them down. In addition, those areas, if you go back to the map and you kind of look, they have culturally a whole lot more to do with Russia, right? So this area right here, they tend to have the Cyrillic language. They tend to be Eastern Orthodox, and that kind of thing. So that's part of this equation too. So Russia tended to see Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia as kind of like little brothers. Austria-Hungary thought they should have a sphere of influence, and so they kind of picked on them a lot. And so you've got this kind of debate about this Balkans region. And it's into this that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary travels into the Balkans in order to try to create some goodwill, in order to try to make people in that region feel happier about being part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So you have hold on, pause. Is it going to pause?